Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. It is just after 7:30 on the 18th of April, 1942, 750 nautical miles west of the home islands of Japan. Two American aircraft carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, are plowing through rough seas, escorted by 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers. They steam in radio silence. The Enterprise does not look unusual, but the Hornet, now that's another story. On the deck of the carrier are not Navy planes. They are US AAF planes. And not only are they Army planes, they are medium bombers. Aircraft that were never designed or intended to fly off an aircraft carrier. Their mission is the Americans' first attempt to strike back at the Empire of Japan after the disastrous attack at Pearl Harbor. For the target of their mission, known officially as Operation Conceal, is none other than the Japanese capital, Tokyo. At 7:38, disaster strikes. The task force is spotted by a Japanese picket boat 10 hours earlier than they had hoped. That's 170 nautical miles, 200 land miles, farther from Japan than planned. Although one of the cruisers, the USS Nashville, blasts the boat out of the water, the damage has been done. A radio message had already been sent, and the Japanese forces know that they are there. A fateful decision needs to be made: abort or go. The air group's commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, decides to go. Unbelievably, none of the pilots, including Doolittle, has made a carrier takeoff before. But as they mount their planes, start their engines, do their run-ups, and start down the heaving carrier deck, they have an advantage. They are flying North American B-25 Mitchells, an airplane that, as we shall see, will seemingly do whatever task it is given, whether it was designed to do that or not, and do it well, including this, taking off from 467 feet of carrier runway. But let's go back to the beginning of the story of this marvelous medium bomber. Design, development, and prototypes. Back in 1938, the United States Army Air Corps issued a circular, which is basically a request or shopping list for what they were looking for in new bombers. This circular requested a payload of 1,200 pounds, a range of 1,200 miles, at more than 200 miles per hour. Several companies took up the challenge to build this new bomber, including Boeing Stearman, Douglas, Martin, and North American. North American's contender was called the NA-40. It looked a bit like the Mitchell would become, but shorter, kind of stubby, and also from a head-on view you can see a difference in the wing design that we will discuss later. Also, the two pilots were arranged in a tandem cockpit, meaning one behind the other. The company was initially disappointed with the NA-40's performance. However, swapping its two 1,100 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines for two 1,600 Wright R2600 twin Cyclones solved the power problem. It presented the updated bomber to the Army for evaluation. On the 11th of April, 1939, the only NA-40 in existence took off with test pilots at the controls, suffered a propeller problem and an engine failure, and crash-landed. The good news was that the crew escaped. The bad news was that the only prototype was destroyed, and so North American was out of the competition. They went back to the drawing board, and Douglas's proposal, the DB-7, ended up getting the contract as the A-20 Havoc. In March of 1939, the Army Air Corps issued a new circular, again looking for a medium bomber, but this time able to carry a bigger payload of 2,400 pounds. The same range of 1,200 miles at a faster speed of 300 miles per hour. North America dusted off the design for the NA-40 to work on plans for the experimental version of the Mitchell, which was known as the YB-25. Lee Atwood, who was North American's vice president and chief engineer, was in charge of the project. In order to meet the new requirements, the new airplane was made slightly bigger, with the wing area being 10 square feet larger, and the fuselage was stretched 6 feet longer. The new airplane was also heavier at 28,000 pounds, as compared to 20,000 pounds for the NA-40. In order to fit the new increased bomb load required, the fuselage was widened, and the tandem cockpit was replaced by a side-by-side cockpit. The new aircraft was a twin-engined, medium-sized bomber with tricycle undercarriage and twin rudders. I've tried to find out the real rationale behind the twin-tail design, but even the Smithsonian's website says, to quote, "The origin of the distinctive twin vertical fin and rudder layout on the B-25 remains obscure, but may simply have been a designer's whim. Whatever the original intent, it made the Mitchell rock solid and controllable if an engine quit." End of quote. It also provided redundancy. If one rudder got shot up in combat, well, then there was always the other one. The bomber was to have a crew of 5, including a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio navigator, and gunner. It was armed with 4 machine guns on flexible mounts. One .30 caliber in the nose, which could be installed on any of 3 ball and socket mounts in the nose, one which pointed straight ahead, and one on each side. Another .30 cal was mounted behind a plexiglass hatch cut into the upper rear fuselage. A third .30 cal had firing positions at each waist window and from a hole in the floor. There was a .50 cal machine gun in the extreme tail, mounted in an unusual-looking, streamlined, transparent canopy, where the tail gunner lay prone in this position to sight and fire his gun. The Army was impressed enough with the design that it purchased the plane off the drawing board, ordering 162 without even seeing a prototype. Another medium bomber, the Martin B-26 Marauder, was also ordered for the same contract in the same manner. The first 2 B-25s came off the production line and were sent for flight testing at Wright Field, Ohio. A problem was immediately encountered. The airplane had a stability problem, which was known as Dutch roll. There are several types of stability at play in an aircraft. Lateral stability is the tendency for the wings to return to level after being displaced. In the B-25, this was partially accomplished by the dihedral of the wings. Dihedral is the angle at which the wing slopes up to the wingtip from where it is attached to the fuselage. On these first B-25s, the dihedral was set at 3 degrees for the whole length of the wing. Directional stability is what keeps the nose of the aircraft pointing forward and is mainly achieved by the tail fin, or in the B-25 case, fins. Dutch roll happens when the lateral stability is more powerful than the directional stability, and the aircraft tends to yaw, which means its nose goes right and left, and then the airplane rolls back and forth. This was not good for an aircraft that was supposed to be a stable, level bombing platform. To fix the problem, North American reduced the overall dihedral of the wing by making it a gull wing, or cranked wing. The wing sloped up to the engine nacelle with the same dihedral as before, and then, from there to the wingtip, it is horizontal. This allowed for more directional stability, and all future B-25s were built with this wing. Supposedly it was Lee Atwood's idea to name the B-25 after General Billy Mitchell. I am ready to be found wrong, but I cannot think of any other American aircraft type that has been named after an individual. General Mitchell has quite the story all on his own, and I plan to tell it during a future episode on big bombers and the theory of strategic bombing, which will help us get set up for talking about Lancasters, Halifaxes, Liberators, and Fortresses. Suffice it to say that Mitchell is now regarded as the father of the U.S. Air Force, even though at one time he was demoted and even court-martialed for his views on air power. It is altogether fitting that an aircraft that saw so much long-lasting success and fame should carry his name. North American aviation was a very busy company during the Second World War. Not only were they producing the B-25, but they were also simultaneously building the single-engined T-6 trainers known as Texans in the United States, or Harvards in Commonwealth countries, and a fighter you may have heard of known as the P-51 Mustang. B-25s were being built in its main plant at Inglewood and in Kansas City. Almost 10,000 Mitchells of all types were built. As I said at the start of this episode, the B-25 was one of those aircraft platforms that seemed to be able to welcome endless modifications. I will mention some of them here, and others will come up during the section on operational history. The first variant, the A, was to get the aircraft ready for combat. It added armor for the crew and self-sealing fuel tanks. These were built of metal sandwiched with a rubber layer. If the metal was punctured, the rubber would melt in the presence of the gasoline, run, and plug the hole. Although these kinds of tanks caused a weight penalty, they were worth it in helping to get the crews home after fighting. It became apparent early on that the B-25 was not armed sufficiently, and so the B variant was meant to solve this problem. The strange tailgun position was changed to a more conventional tailgun and dorsal turret added with twin 50 caliber machine guns. It was this type that would fly on the Doolittle raid, and 23 were also supplied to the British. The C and D variants added upgraded engines, de-icing equipment, and the nose armament was beefed up to two 50 cal machine guns. One fixed firing straight ahead, and one on a flexible mount. They built almost 4,000 of this type, and they were also used by the UK, Canada, China, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. 45 Mitchells were also set up for photographic reconnaissance. All of the armor, armament, and bombing equipment were omitted, and 3 K-17 cameras were installed. 4 were converted to weather reconnaissance, where they were especially useful on the North Atlantic ferry routes, where aircraft were being flown over to Europe. There were several gunship versions, which will be described in greater detail later, and there were even 2 executive VIP transport B-25s, used by Hap H. Arnold and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Didn't I tell you that this airplane would do whatever it was asked to do? In Part 2, we'll look at the operational history of the B-25, so be sure to come back for that.